When we think of space, we naturally think of the stars, solar systems, galaxy, the distant reaches of the universe.
But space has another dimension to explore, not outward, but inward, into all the basic elements of everything there is on our planet.
Here, a miniature world of space exists, a world filled with constant motion, one that went undetected for centuries. It is the world of the atom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Free Radical Media Podcast. I am Eric Scott Picard, one of your two co-hosts tonight, the other one being Patrick Ryan. Tonight, we're going to have a pretty interesting guest. We're going to talk to Martin Ball, ph.D. in Religious Studies. He's an entheogenic author, musician, visionary artist, and energetic guide. He's an author of numerous articles, which you can find online. We'll link to several of the ones we're going to mention tonight, as well as several books, including Being Human, an Entheological Guide to God, Evolution, and the Fractal Energetic Nature of Reality, and his latest book, Being Infinite, an Entheogenic Odyssey into the Limitless Eternal, a memoir from ayahuasca to Zen. I guess we should just jump right on into this. Martin, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, you're trained in religious studies, and obviously it seems like the majority of your work that is of interest to the audience is in entheogens. Tell me a little bit about how you originally came to become interested in this line of study.
Well, I got interested in religious studies kind of coming out of philosophy, actually, as an undergraduate, that I was a philosophy major. And before I decided as a philosophy major, it was kind of a toss-up between perhaps theoretical physics or philosophy. So I was very interested in just the nature of reality and, just trying to figure things out for myself at that point in time. And as I was a philosophy student, I became more and more interested, particularly in Buddhist philosophy and also Taoist philosophy, but was somewhat frustrated being a philosophy student because you don't study Taoism or Buddhist philosophy in philosophy departments. You just study Western philosophy. So I ended up kind of migrating over into religious studies and did that as a minor, as an undergraduate, then went on to get my MA and PhD in religious studies. And even there, my intention was to study Buddhist philosophy, but I kind of got pulled into studying Native American traditions. And so that's ended up being what I emphasized for my master's and my PhD. But very broadly, just interested in questions about the nature of reality and how do we know what it is that we think that we know. And that's one of the original things that really drew me to Buddhism as sort of a methodology for self-inquiry and understanding the nature of being and the nature of the self. And presented in a way that, I wasn't raised religious at all. So religion to me was just all about beliefs and doctrines and dogma and mythology. And I became interested in Zen Buddhism because it also presented a very clear methodology of basically sit down, shut up, pay attention. And I liked that. And I liked what I read about Zen Buddhism. So that's kind of what drew me into that area. And outside of that, I became interested in entheogens and psychedelics just out of my own personal experiences. So kind of studied that along with the study of culture, the study of religion and metaphysics and different systems. But it was never really an official part of my studies, as a student. So that was really something that I was just doing on my own.
Okay, sure. So what exactly drew you then to the entheogenic experience, on a personal level, right? I mean, was it purely through the philosophy, or was it?
Well, my first experiences, like many people, was with cannabis, with marijuana. And so from those early experiences as a teenager, I very quickly decided that I was not being given accurate information by the powers that be about these kinds of substances because, at the time it was the Nancy Reagan just say no era, and a lot of anti-propaganda or a lot of hype about marijuana and things like that. And from my experiences of smoking marijuana, I just thought it was fantastic. It felt deep and philosophical, and I just wanted to write poetry and make art and make music, and I had a really fantastic time. So I started to suspect that probably the other things I were being told about these substances probably weren't really true, or at least inaccurate. And also just kind of observing that here alcohol was legal and is just making people stupid and just doing terrible things to each other and to themselves and really dumbing people down. And so I became kind of curious as sort of the, alternative minded person that I was. And between my first and second year of college, it was my first opportunity to experience psilocybin mushrooms. And at first I just thought they were really strange and uncomfortable. That was from my first experience. But then my second experience was quite a bit stronger. And suddenly it made more sense to me about why this was an interesting experience. So from there, I just started trying to find things to read about, telling more about different psychedelics and things like that. And so that's kind of how I got into that area. And also from my experiences, it really seemed to reflect back on things that I was reading in say, Buddhism or Taoism about being present with yourself, letting go of your structures of belief and, going with the flow, so to speak. So for me, it was a way of accessing what I thought about these spiritual traditions from someone who's completely on the outside of those traditions. So that's really where the interest was generated from.
Now, you said you got into psilocybin in college, and then I know you've written some books on Salvia divinorum,
Mm-hmm.
and I know you're also very well versed in DMT and 5-MeO DMT. How soon after your psilocybin experience did you start experimenting with those substances?
It was quite some time, really. Gosh, just trying to think of the chronology here. So my first psilocybin experience was probably 91 or 92, somewhere in there.
Okay.
And it wasn't until my first time at Burning Man, which was at 2001, that I first experienced Salvia divinorum. So up until that time period, the only psychedelic I'd ever experienced was psilocybin mushrooms. And I had kind of had a regular routine of using those, like usually my spring break. So at the time, I was with a woman that I eventually married and then eventually divorced. But during that time period, when I was a graduate student, she was also an elementary school teacher, and our spring breaks in the school system didn't line up. So one of my things was every spring break is I would get a nice bag of mushrooms, and then I would eat mushrooms most of the week long because she was at work and I didn't have to go to school. And so that was kind of my activity for my spring break, was sitting around and eating psilocybin mushrooms and seeing what came up. Yeah, and then I had actually read an article in the LA Times after I completed graduate school. This was in the year 2000 or sometime early in 2001. And the article was about Daniel Siebert and his website, sagewisdom.org. And that was the first time that I had ever seen anything advertising any kind of entheogen that you could just order off the internet. I read this article. Immediately I went to the computer and I looked it up. It's like, my God, here's this website. You can get Salvia divinorum. And I had read about Salvia divinorum as my studies in Native American cultures and entheogens and all of that. So I had certainly read about it, but I didn't know you could just order it off the internet. And I guess actually at the time I was a little bit out of the loop, but you probably could have ordered a lot of things off the internet quite easily at that point in time, that now it's a little bit trickier to get things. But anyway,
Right.
I ordered Salvia online and got some enhanced leaf, and then experienced that first at Burning Man later on that year. And then that kind of became a regular part of my practice of actually doing Zen meditation with Salvia divinorum.
Hmm.
Um, and so then it wasn't until late 2007, well, actually, I'd say 2006, I published my book, Mushroom Wisdom. And after that, a gentleman had contacted me and he wanted a copy of the book, but he said that he couldn't afford it, but that he could do me a trade if I wanted. So I said, okay, let's do a trade. And he ended up sending me some yopo seeds. And yeah, yopo seeds contain 5-MeO DMT in them. So that was my first time ever experimenting with 5-MeO. But with the yopo seeds, it was very, very mild. And for me, if ever given a choice, if I had, 20, 30 minutes, salvia or yopo seeds, I would definitely go for salvia because it was so much more effective than the yopo seeds. But then in late 2007, my wife and I ended up splitting up, and I moved up here to Ashland, Oregon, where I am now. And pretty soon after I moved up here, desperately looking for work anywhere, I had applied for a job at a record company in Medford, Oregon. And a gentleman who received that application online took a look at my webpage, and I had this ongoing theme camp at Burning Man called the God Box. And another name for the God Box was the Mystic Toad. And this was a mailbox that I had constructed into the form of a toad. And you had to go through this ritual at our theme camp to go and get some FaceTime with the Mystic Toad and open the God Box and see what was inside. So anyway, this guy saw my website, and he saw this Mystic Toad on my website, and he ended up calling me, and he asked, he said, well, what kind of Mystic Toad do you have? And I said, well, it's a mailbox. It's nothing special. It's just a mailbox. And he said, oh, well, I've got the real thing if you'd like to come over and try it. And so here was an invitation to go and experience 5-MeO DMT. And the first time I went over to his place, he had Sonoran desert toad venom, and he only had a little bit, and so he wanted to have enough to give to me and the woman I was with at the time, and then also have some for himself. So he just put a little bit in, and honestly, it wasn't enough. So it was just kind of yeah, interesting. It was more interesting than yopo seeds, but not all that interesting. And again, compared to Salvia divinorum, it really wasn't much of anything. So then another month went by, and he this time had an extract of 5-MeO DMT, and he loaded up this vaporizer. And before the hit was even all the way in, I knew it was it. That, oh my God, this is it. And it was the most profound experience I had ever had in my life up until that point. And also I'd been sort of a philosophical, atheist, Buddhist, shamanic kind of type, not really certain about the nature of God or, and well, it's all connected. It's all consciousness, Buddha mind, whatever. But in taking this hit of 5-MeO DMT, it was in this glass piston, and it was filled with this vapor from the vaporized 5-MeO. And so you could watch this glass piston, as you're taking a hit, you see the piston come down, and you can see the hit, as you're pulling it in. And I got about 2/3 of the way down of that piston that I didn't even take the whole hit. And, as I was inhaling, it was just the immediate recognition of, oh my God, it's God, which was so surprising to me, because here it was pure consciousness, but it wasn't this abstract, empty Buddha mind that I had studied as a Buddhist student. It was very much alive. It was very much a presence, and it was everything. And that included me. So it was the most bizarre experience I had had in my life. And just instantly, I just started saying thank you. I said, thank you, God. And then I said thank you for about 45 minutes or so. Meanwhile, I'm laughing and crying all at the same time, because as this experience unfolded for me, it was just immediately clear that this was exactly what I had been looking for my entire life. but didn't even know that that's what I was looking for. But as it was happening, it was clear that this is it. This is the most important thing I've ever experienced, and that this is going to change everything for me. So that was back in very early 2008 at that point. And then after that, I had some people who invited me to try DMT. And then I became very curious about trying different synthetic tryptamines and such. So I tried a whole variety of those, and I found a few that I'm particularly fond of. But really, for the whole first 10 years of my experience with entheogens, it was strictly psilocybin. And then the next 7 years was psilocybin in conjunction with Salvia divinorum. So it's only been the past 6 or 7 years now that I've really explored many of these other entheogens. Then also here in Ashland, spent a lot of time several years ago at the Santo Daime Church and drinking daime, going to works 2 or 3 times a month. And there you're drinking daime, anywhere from 3 to 5 times in a work. So I drank a lot of daime, also went to some ayahuasca sessions locally, and also to the Native American church locally. But I don't do ceremony or anything like that anymore. So that was a particular time period where I was going through this very profound opening that kind of started with that 5-MeO experience and then kind of culminated in the spring of 2009.
Interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit on the difference between 5-MeO DMT and just regular DMT?
Sure. Well, they're both endogenous tryptamines. And the molecular structure is such that 5-MeO DMT has a 5-methoxy group that's adjoined to the basic DMT molecule. So structurally, they're very, very similar, but experientially, they're very different. They're both extraordinarily strong, but whereas DMT, we could say, is really strong, 5-MeO DMT is infinitely strong. So it's actually much, much, much stronger, which is, it can be difficult for people to appreciate that if they've experienced DMT, because that's an incredibly powerful entheogen. And so it's hard to imagine that something could be more powerful and more overwhelming than that. And 5-MeO is. So just to kind of compare, there's what I would like to call a full release dose, meaning that there's this full energetic opening and you're completely consumed by the experience and completely overwhelmed by it. And it takes a lot more DMT to have an experience like that than it does of 5-MeO. So whereas DMT, for a full release dose, we're talking about anywhere from 50 to 100 milligrams. 5-MeO DMT is like 10 to 15 milligrams.
Wow.
DMT tends to last for maybe around 5 minutes, 15 minutes at the absolute maximum. Now we're talking about if you're smoking it or if you're vaporizing it. So it's very fast acting, comes on within a matter of seconds. And also with DMT, you usually need to take at least a few hits to really get a full release dose. 5-MeO DMT also comes on within a matter of seconds. If you get enough, you only need one hit, and it goes from 0 to infinity in about 10 seconds. And then you have this kind of plateau period where if someone is completely able to release from the energetic structures of their ego, they go into this full unitary state of being. And that will last, for some people, it can only last just a few brief seconds. I mean, the ego is very, very tenacious. So sometimes someone can open up and then the ego just clinks right back in.
Right.
But if someone's nice and relaxed and they're really able to let their structures go, that time period can last for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes at the most, where experientially, it feels as though you're dying. So here, within the first couple seconds, you see the individual has a choice. They think, oh my God, I'm dying. And they can either say, oh, okay, good. Let's let that happen and let's see what's on the other side of this and just relax fully into the experience, or the ego can hold on. And then there's all different kinds of intermediary stages where people are relaxing, but their ego is still present. But anyway, if they get all the way open, that lasts for 10 to 20 minutes. But then as soon as the energy gets low enough, then the ego starts to reintegrate. But during that time period, it's very difficult for a person to know where in the universe they may be, because it's just this experience of absolute unity and pure God consciousness in that time period. And for people who are new to the experience, that usually becomes a whiteout, where after their ego comes back, they say, where was I? What was I doing? There's just a blank in my memory, because they're not able to process that level of just intense awareness. So then the ego starts to come back in. And then even at that point, when the ego comes back in, the person will probably feel like they're tripping harder than they've ever tripped in their life, and that it's just impossibly strong. But the ego is very tenacious. It can come back in even in those very highly intense states. And then you have another 10 to 20 minutes. So overall, again, DMT lasts maybe 5 to 10 minutes. 5-MeO DMT lasts more like 30 to 40 minutes, or possibly even longer if someone's really relaxed and open with it. And another point of comparison is that DMT is kind of hyper visual. I mean, it's the most visually intense entheogen that you could take, where everything is just bright neon, high definition, everything's moving, everything's changing, it's vast, it's infinite, it's really complex, very, very beautiful. But it has this very, very strong visual nature. And in contrast, 5-MeO DMT can be very visual, but it's the visual quality sometimes is not even present. Sometimes it's just a vast emptiness, like someone's eyes might be open and they don't even see the room that they're in, but they're not seeing anything else. It's just this pure crystalline emptiness. It's very hard to describe. And whereas DMT is kind of bright, neon, very vibrant, very vivid colors, 5-MeO DMT is much more like pure white light that's shining through an infinitely complex prism. So it's more like white light that's just subtly rainbowed out. And it's very, very beautiful, but it's not the bright neon high definition of DMT. So the visual quality is very different. So if someone is really into quote unquote hallucinating, they would probably gravitate more towards DMT because it has a strong visual component. But also within that, there's a much greater likelihood that people are going to project things into that visual matrix and get confused and caught in that, whereas it's harder to do that with this vast void that is 5-MeO DMT, though it can be very, very visual as well, but the quality is just quite different. It's much clearer.
Wow. And 5-MeO, that's a part of human metabolism too, right?
Yes, it is, just like DMT. It's kind of interesting. I mean, right now there's obviously a lot of interest in DMT, and everyone's very curious about whether it's produced by the pineal gland, and everyone wants to know more about DMT, and is it involved with dreaming and dying and all of these things.
Right,
and,
right.
I think that those are all very interesting, very legitimate questions, but I also find it curious that people aren't asking the same things about 5-MeO, because we're also producing 5-MeO inside our bodies. All mammals produce 5-MeO DMT, and that to me seems much more closely related to experiences of enlightenment, or what is called samadhi in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, where there's just the dawning of the pure light of the mind, or in Tibetan Buddhism it'd be called rigpa, of just this pure white light. And to me that's much more interesting than the sometimes crazy visual content of DMT. So it's something that I talk a lot about. It's something that I write a lot about, because I'd like to see more people get interested in 5-MeO, because it is, for me, it's the most profound entheogen that exists, and it just so far surpasses everything else that people need to know more about it. Because especially if people are thinking kind of DMT is sort of the end of the line in terms of it doesn't get any bigger than this, it doesn't get any more profound than this. Honestly, for me, DMT is kind of in the realm of entertainment, whereas 5-MeO DMT is in the realm of the absolutely profound.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
Yeah, that dichotomy there. And it seems like it's several levels of magnitude different. it's it's interesting. You're talking about, you get into that God consciousness, right?
Yeah.
And you have that profound experience, the death of the ego. It's it goes back to, again, your shamanic philosophies, right? And it goes into, psychological concepts, but it seems like these substances and those states kind of bridge the gap. You know what I mean? What do you think? What do you think that consciousness is? What do you think the God consciousness is?
Well, I would just describe it as the fundamental nature of being. It is the consciousness that is everything. And I mean, that's one of the things that reveals itself in the 5-MeO experience so much more clearly than in the experiences of so many of these other medicines. That, you hear about people having these peak experiences, certainly with psilocybin and DMT and ayahuasca. But it's very rare that you hear people talking about that, that it's considered a very exceptional experience, whereas it's much more par for the course within the 5-MeO experience. And what it revealed for me is that all of reality, everything that exists, is this one universal being in consciousness. So I use the word God because that seems pretty fitting for me, but I don't mean by that a transcendent God that somehow exists outside of or above or beyond reality. That
Yeah.
in religious philosophy, or the philosophy of religion, this is called a pantheistic view, with the idea that God actually is reality itself. God is the very process of reality, and that everything is this one universal consciousness and being. And that's really the experience of a full release into 5-MeO DMT. So one way that people might describe it is the realization that they are God. Because, of course, if God is everything, that includes the person who's having the experience. So it's not, it shouldn't be confused with a personal claim to say, hello, I'm the individual who is God, and this is all my creation, and you are all my minions, or something like that. No, it's the realization that I'm God, you're God, everything's God. Everything is this one living consciousness, and that we are embodiments of that. And that another way of describing this in the philosophy of religion is to describe it as a non-dual experience. So in most ordinary experiences, we're operating from a level that's described as dualistic, where there is an apparent separation between subject and object. So for example, here at this moment, I'm sitting in front of my desk, I'm speaking into a microphone, I'm looking at my computer screen that has your little atomic picture on Skype, and all of these things seem separate from me. These are objects that exist outside of my normal sense of self, which is encapsulated here in my physical person and also in just my own private awareness of the world that I'm experiencing from this perspective. And the same would hold true for you, for both of you. And so we're sitting here in a dualistic mode, and there's an apparent separation. There's a distinction between subject and object. But in the non-dual experience, that sense of separation between subject and object dissolves and disappears. And so there's no longer a subject experiencing something. There is just the pure awareness of experience itself. And within that, there is no subject and there is no object. It's just one universal sense of being and experience. And that's also why visually this tends to occur when there's no visual content, because visual content always implies there's someone seeing and there's something being seen. So vision itself kind of relies on apparent duality in order to function, as does communication, such as we're having right now. So all of our normal experiences are kind of couched in this duality. But when we transcend that, we go into the non-dual. And this would be considered the very heart, for example, of Buddhist tradition, that the whole point of meditating is to have the non-dual experience and to realize that there actually is no self. That subject, who I think I am, is just a temporary construct. There's nothing essential to that.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. That's that mystic idea of, the Godhead, being reality and experiencing itself constantly.
Yes.
And it seems like what you're saying, it reminds me of the concept that really in our day-to-day lives, we don't really perceive reality at all. We're just perceiving senses, into our central nervous system. I mean, we're just kind of experiencing data that's being collected through our eyes, our ears, our feeling of touch, right? So we're not experiencing any kind of objective reality in that sense. But it seems like if you get into this state, you begin to experience what the actual reality of the universe is.
Yeah, I think
Right?
that that's a good way to describe it. And, operating at the dualistic level that we're normally functioning in, that certainly there is greater and less congruence between kind of the virtual reality we're creating for ourselves through our senses and then reconstructing this image and sensations within our mind, that we can be closer to what's really going on, and we can also be much, much further apart from what's really going on. I mean, people can be very confused, people can be deluded, and then we can also be relatively accurate in the way that we're reconstructing the world. But it's all done from this perspective of, as human beings, we all come with this thing called an ego. And the ego is this collection of energetic patterns that we develop over the course of our lives, and primarily through childhood and adolescence, through which we create a sense of who it is that we think that we are. And this includes our thought patterns, our belief systems, our gestures, our tone of voice, our body movements. All of these things go into creating a sense of self. And so everything that we are experiencing is kind of filtered through that in a way that doesn't seem to be apparent for other animals.
Sure.
Like my dog doesn't do that. My dog is just present with whatever is happening, but she doesn't have an ongoing narrative about who it is that she thinks she is that's filtering everything. Whereas we're always doing that as human beings because we have these egos. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way that we work. So it's not to say that the ego is bad, but the ego can also get very confused. And the ego has a very difficult time making a distinction between what it thinks is the case and what really is the case. And so the ego makes up ideas and then behaves as though those ideas actually are reality. So it creates all kinds of opportunity for distortion and projection and attachment. And we govern ourselves by trying to protect our sense of self and our sense of identity. And that's one of the reasons that entheogens, particularly things like 5-MeO-DMT, might be viewed as threatening to people, is because it actually has the power to dissolve that sense of self, albeit temporarily. I mean, it does come back, but in that intervening time period, the fundamental nature of being, which has always been there and is always there, and it doesn't go anywhere. So it's not a place that you go to. It's not a state that you reach. It's uncovering the false masks that we put on top of it through our own personal perspective. It can dissolve those temporarily so that we can enter fully into our natural state of being. So in one way of describing it is to say, look, everybody is already enlightened because everyone is God embodied in their particular form, in their particular perspective. But the character that they're playing through their ego doesn't realize that they're already enlightened. So they've constructed a sense of self that says, well, I'm not enlightened, or I'm not that, or God exists outside of me, or I don't know who I am, or I'm this soul, or whatever it is that people conceive of themselves as being. These are just constructs that we're making in our mind and through our patterns and behavior.
Sure.
And when we introduce enough energy into the system, we can actually override that temporarily. And within that, people get all kinds of blocks in their energy, the ways that they think about themselves, ways that they behave, patterns that they've constructed. And so when we work with entheogens in this way of working with the non-dual, it really helps us to find where we have these knots energetically in our sense of self and to release those. And then someone can come out of that in a way that feels like the most profound reset. One of the metaphors that I use to describe this is that through our egos, our energetic system is kind of like the hard drive on a computer, where the more we're using it, the more fragmented and disjointed the hard drive gets. And so sometimes we need to defragment the hard drive, and then everything works better on the computer. Well, the human being is very similar in that through the ego, we develop these patterns which aren't necessarily authentic for us. We're doing things because we think we should, or we're competing with what we naturally feel. And that creates distortions and blocks for us. And so when we can go into the non-dual state and release all of this pent-up energy that we have, then we can function much more smoothly and much more clearly in normal dualistic reality. So it's a profound healing tool in that sense, and not necessarily a physically healing, but more of at the deeper energetic level. Because the physical issues that people have are usually reflective of something deeper that's going on, more fundamental energetically in their sense of self.
Sure, sure. It's fascinating to me that, with this sort of resurgence of psychedelics in the last 20 years, 20 or 30 years, ayahuasca in particular, that if you really kind of get deep into the ayahuasca shamanism, there's not very many curanderos talking about the non-dualistic sort of experience. Now, I don't know if it's just because it's not part of their culture, but a lot of these ayahuasca visions, or their whole sort of narrative they have of the ayahuasca experience, very much deals with dealing with malignant entities or dealing with sorcery. It's a very, I guess you could call it, dualistic in its nature. And it's always I've always found it curious. It's like, well, why are the Eastern religions, because I've had similar experiences to you, where I have this sort of non-dual realization on entheogens. But then I'm always curious about these shamans. Their experiences don't really seem to sort of jive with that.
Yeah, it's a very different worldview. It's a very different setting in which all that is functioning. And, if we look at it from a historical and anthropological perspective, it certainly makes sense that shamanic traditions are operating more at a dualistic level rather than at the non-dual level, because historically, most shamanic traditions are taking place in, what is, it's not really the best term, but what is called hunter-gatherer societies. So these are people who are living very close to nature, and they're often on a day-to-day survival basis, having to figure out how best to operate within their environment and how to survive. And within that context, the non-dual realization is not necessarily the most beneficial, because they're needing to interact with plants and animals and all of this on an ongoing daily basis. And so what the shamanism is really doing is trying to mediate those relationships between these apparently separate entities and create harmony and balance within that. And that serves a certain survival function. And if we look at the non-dual spiritual traditions, these have all arisen within relatively highly structured societies. So like Buddhism comes out of India at a time where culturally, there were a highly stratified society, very complex social structures and systems. And it was because of that, it's possible, because society is functioning at this kind of level, it's possible for someone like the Buddha to say, hey, I'm going to go cop out for a while and just go sit underneath a tree. I don't need to worry about surviving or my society surviving. It's going to keep going with or without me. And I'm going to go and try and get to the bottom of all this and go beyond the visions, go beyond the gods, go beyond the spirits, and see what's really there, rather than what he received through Hindu religious tradition that would have been popular at the time. So the non-dual seems to arise when human beings have the luxury, in a sense, to really get to the bottom of their experience. And in that sense, again, that doesn't really serve the survival function of a shamanic society. And so now, with ayahuasca and ayahuasca shamanism, that it's still kind of operating within that mode. And some of the places where it's actually shifted a little bit has been in the syncretic churches out of Brazil. For example, with Santo Daime, they incorporated a lot of the shamanism and a lot of the sense of entities and astral realms. But one of the core doctrines of the Santo Daime is that Christ consciousness is actually everyone's inherent birthright. And Christ consciousness would be their term for the non-dual experience of the realization of your godhood, your God nature. So kind of the highest reaches of the Santo Daime is now branching into the mystical, though a lot of it is still operating, I would say, more at this shamanic intermediary realm, where there's a lot of narrative, there's a lot of story about entities and my soul and your soul, and you have this karma you need to work out, and this person has that karma. So it's kind of mixed in that sense. But historically, and just in terms of the overall numbers within human societies, that the non-dual experience is very, very rare. It doesn't show up very often because it takes a huge amount of trust and willingness, because it's ultimately destructive in the sense that a lot of people, through their spirituality, they create narratives for themselves of who it is they think they are, what kind of mission they think they're on, or what their spiritual role is and what their identity is. And the non-dual experience just takes all of that and destroys it, because it says that it reveals that, guess what? Everything you thought about yourself is just a story you've been telling to create a sense of self. Underneath it all, you're God. You always have been. You always will be. Everything is just one consciousness. There's only one actor that is playing out billions of different roles simultaneously. And all of this is the true nature of the self. And so that takes whatever spiritual story you've been telling yourself and just puts it in the blender and just absolutely destroys it. So it's not something that necessarily everybody wants to do, because a lot of people are happy with the stories that they're telling themselves about themselves, that it gives them a sense of identity and a sense of purpose, and it gives them goals for their lives. And it's terrifying, actually, to have all of that stripped away and just to have it all be revealed that, guess what, it's all just you. You've just been playing a game with yourself all along. And it also reveals that you are fully responsible for all of your own choices. And that can be terrifying for people. It feels like a huge responsibility.
Right. The old existentialist phrase, man is condemned to be free, right?
Yeah.
The ultimate responsibility, that Sartre talked about. Absolutely. And I think increasingly, more and more people do want that. I think it's part of why there's such an interest in this kind of thing now. Talk a lot about the fact that modern culture is very alienating, very isolating, and to have experiences like this, it kind of opens a new perspective for people, I think.
I think it does. And I do think that people want it as well, because there's this resurgence of interest in spirituality, and particularly spirituality that is experientially based. And for some people, that's the basic distinction they make. They say, well, religion is about believing things, and spirituality is about experiencing things and getting to know it for yourself. But, when we see out in society, people are, try and bring different spiritual traditions together and things like that. But we can see that actually a lot of these spiritual traditions and religions, they create a lot of divisions among people, because it sets up different camps, different tribes, different identities. And sometimes they get along, and other times they just want to kill each other. And so I think that there's a strong interest among people to, people describe it as get back to unity. And that's actually the phraseology. I don't like that, because you can't get back to unity. You're already in unity. You just don't know it, perhaps. So it's kind of, it's about removing the confusion that gets in the way of just seeing that and realizing that. But the non-dual experience, that's the fastest way to universal world peace, as far as I'm concerned, and also the transformation of society into something that's actually sustainable and beneficial for everyone. Because if the non-dual unitary experience is real, and I'm absolutely convinced that it is real, that means every other person is just another version of me. So why would I ever want to fight with that person or try and compete with that person or try and take something away from them or rule over them. It opens up this profound level of respect and universal love that really has the power to transform pretty much everything from a completely non-sectarian perspective, because it's not about this religion or that religion or which one's right or which one is whatever. It's because it's just you, right?
Sure.
It's just the nature of everyone, and it's not about any particular belief system. And so it's a way also to transcend all of that into a way that is vibrant and energetically charged, that is really powerful and transformative. And so I think it's it's time for people to be interested in this, and so that's why people are interested in it, because it's, in a sense, it's what needs to happen. All right, can we swear on your show? I wanted to say a swear word.
Absolutely,
Go
you
for it.
can. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've done it before, and then I've had the interviewer come back and say, "Oh, sorry, but we can't swear on the podcast." But anyway,
Yeah.
people want people want to get over their bullshit, and they
Yeah.
want to get over the crap that confuses all of us, and the fact that anyone can experience this given the right dedication and willingness and openness is powerful and can create a powerful movement within society, that
Yeah.
is not tied to any tradition. It's just the nature of reality.
Definitely, definitely. And I've heard experiences of of people who came back from the Amazon and had run-ins with what they call down there, like dark sorcerers or
Yeah.
brujos or whatever. And to me, all their experiences seem to have a common theme. It's like these shaman they were working with got them too caught up in the bullshit, got them too caught up in the spirits and this and that, and sort of like diverted them away from the actual goal, from the Godhead, so to speak. And it's almost like that whole, fetishizing the whole spirit realm or the astral realm, it's sort of like, I think that's at the essence of the dark side of these substances. It sort of takes you away and diverts you from the source and gets you caught up in
Yeah.
all the nonsense, which is infinite.
Yeah, because that kind of stuff can just go on and on and on, and it also creates power imbalances. One of the things that always come to mind when speaking about this is a documentary that I watched about people going down to the Amazon and drinking ayahuasca with some ayahuasqueros down there. And there's this one woman, so it follows this group of people for like a week, and they do 5 sessions with ayahuasca. And there's this one woman who's claiming that every time she drinks ayahuasca, that she's being raped by demons. And so the shaman is then talking to her about, oh, well, it's this witchcraft and you picked up this entity and we've got to do like this exorcism to get rid of this. And so this whole power play dynamic comes in. And at one level, we could say, well, hey, he's just using a metaphorical language to give her tools to work with to release this. But on the other hand, we could say, well, look, he's presenting her with stories and attachments. And the deeper lesson is not that we need to perform an exorcism to get rid of this entity that's attacking you. The deeper lesson is, well, did you know that this entity is actually you and you're doing it to yourself? So why are you doing that? You need to take responsibility for yourself, not putting it onto the magic of the shaman or the ritual, or we have to appease these entities. That, for me, that's all very surface level. It's very much trapped in narrative, and it's not the real issue. It's a shadow play. It's an illusion. It's like going back to the metaphor of Plato's cave. It's
Right.
being caught up at those projections and not actually getting out into the light and seeing, oh, that's what's really going on here.
Yeah.
And that's where the true empowerment is. And of course, shamans are going to be invested in this as well, in the sense, well, that's their profession, to remove entities and work with spirits and things like that. And I'm not trying to say that they're necessarily malicious about that, but that, they're using the tools that they have that's available to them and within their tradition and within their culture. But I do think that there's something deeper that's more profound, and that ultimately I would propose that that's what people are really looking for, even if they don't know it. Like with me, when I had that first experience with 5-MeO, the immediate recognition was, because I'd tried the whole shamanic path. I'd been doing that with salvia and with psilocybin, but when it was this complete unfolding into pure God nature, it was just, oh, this is it. I didn't even realize it, but this actually is it. Everything else that I thought I was doing as a spiritual person was just this puppet show I was putting on for myself, even though it seemed very real and it seemed very effective and other people liked it and I got results or whatever. This is the real thing. And so at that point, for me, the interest in the surface level visionary phenomenon of entities and shamanism, that it pretty much evaporated right at that point, because it was like, well, I just got to the bottom of it, and that's what I need to figure out. And it took a long time for me to really come to grips with what that experience was. But at that point, I knew it, that, okay, this is it. This is what I have to figure out. This is what I have to make peace with, not any of that other stuff. And it's not about being a spiritual person or, a shamanic character or whoever the hell it is that I think that I am, because that's all story. So how do I get back to this place that's underneath the story and just rest within that and then live my life from that place without needing to put a story on myself?
Reminds me a lot of, I've read a lot of the sage Ramana Maharshi, and when he describes the moment he had become quote unquote enlightened, he said he had never meditated or done any yoga basically at all in his life. And I believe he was on his way to school, and he just sort of like dropped dead. And apparently he experienced biological death for like a few minutes. And it was the recognition that the I had died, but there was a deeper I that was still there beneath it. And it was like, once he had fully recognized that, it was like, that was it. That was all it took. Yeah.
And it's kind of this Pandora's box, it's like once you have that, you can't really go back, because the small I, the individual self that we experience ourselves as, at that point just feels like a character that, you're still invested in your life and your perspective, because, hey, you're experiencing it from that perspective. But it's like, it's almost as though you suddenly found out that everything in your life is just a movie.
Right.
And you thought that this was quote unquote real life, but actually it in a sense it isn't, even though it is. And that the big I that's underneath, when you realize that I is you and that it's everyone and everything else, it just becomes this big play in a sense. It's just a big game. It's like every other person is just another version of me, and some of them recognize that we're actually the same, and most of them don't. So it's like all these actors who are so invested in their character that they don't even realize that they're just an actor. And so it becomes very odd. It opens up all kinds of questions for people, like, well, then how do I interact in society? What do I do with my family or my job or any of that? So it's definitely very unsettling. And one of the most unsettling aspects about it is that the experience itself, I mean, we can sit here and we can talk about it, we can point towards it, but in our rational, conceptual, logical mind, it does not fit into any concepts. And so anything that we say about it is just kind of suggesting what it really is, that it's so infinite and so complex and so astounding that the rational mind cannot hold a concept of what this experience is. It can only be directly experienced itself. So it's very shattering for the mind intellectually that way. And it makes it very difficult to communicate to someone else. But yet there's a desire to do so. There's a desire to share it. And then once you meet someone who has shared it, it's like, okay, I know what you're talking about. And people who haven't experienced it might think that they know what you're talking about. But as soon as you have the experience, you realize, wow, I actually had no idea. I thought I did, but I had no idea. And letting the mind rest in that infinite openness without trying to box it in is a challenge, because the mind and the ego is a habitual categorizer. It wants to name everything and label everything and put it in a box and say this is this and that is that. So it's a hard habit to break.
No, yeah, I mean, God, it's it really is. And I was just reading a quote from this article that, I mean, I think you were kind of touching on this point. I'd like to just read this quote briefly. Through teaching about the entheological paradigm, that is what I hope to share with others, a genuine path to true liberation. To get there, though, all illusions must be overcome and released, including those generated by our most beloved entertainers and cultural icons, as well as all religions, spiritual systems, and cultural belief systems. And this is something that we often talk about, getting right down even into culture. You know, we need to shed these things to have any kind of true understanding of what's going on around us, or, you know, understanding of each other. And I think that's really, you know, kind of what you're talking about there. And I just I jotted this quote down earlier. I really enjoyed that quote. It is very liberating, you know, the shedding of all these kind of dogmatic, you know, doctrines. You know, it seems like it seems like you said, it can only be experienced, but I mean, really, it's important work, I think.
Yeah, and you know, it's not even just the big dogmas, you know, it's even the little things, like, again, sitting here and I'm holding a glass of water, and anything that I do to convince myself that this glass of water is not actually me, that's something that needs to be overcome. And in a sense, mentally, this is very dangerous, in the sense that people can really lose it. You know, like in Tibetan Buddhism, again, the high point of Buddhism is to reach the non-dual experience. And within Tibetan Buddhism, they say that Tantra is the quickest path in order to reach that non-dual realization. But they also say that it's incredibly dangerous, that people can lose their minds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really weird to think that the glass of water is me. You know, that sounds like a really odd statement. And yet this is the position that I find myself in now, and recognizing that the universal self is everything. So the glass of water actually is me. It's not my personal physical body, but it's still me in the much larger sense. That these ideas are so slippery, and being able to be in that realistically and not in a completely diluted state is a challenge. So it's not just the big ideas, it's even the little teeny tiny ideas. And it creates this weird balance of recognizing, okay, since everything is the self and I love myself, I love everything. So I have this sense of universal, infinite love, yet I still have my own preferences. So how do we navigate this weird interface between the dualistic reality of I'm here and you're there, and the non-dual reality that we're all one? So I love everything, but that doesn't mean that I actually like everyone. And I love everything, but it doesn't mean I want to drink a glass of uranium, because I know that that'd be really bad for my body. And or like the other day, I was out walking my dog, and my dog got attacked by 2 pit bulls. And man, I did everything I could to fight out those other 2 pit bulls, because my preference is for my dog, not for those 2 dogs.
Yeah, right.
Yet
yeah.
I still love them. I still love those dogs, and I love the owner that let them out of their gate and attacked my dog, yet I do not like that event. So it's tricky to navigate that, okay, there's certain things I like and certain things I don't like, yet I also love universally. And being able to find the balance within that, it's not easy. None of this is easy. And, you know, 5-MeO DMT makes it easier, because it gives us, now I personally, I haven't died, so I can't say this with absolute authority, but my feeling is that the experience of 5-MeO-DMT, a full release dose of 5-MeO-DMT, is probably the closest anyone can come to the experience of dying without actually having to do it. And because of that, because it's a molecule that we can ingest and have this experience, we can produce it not quite on demand because results do vary, but almost on demand, means that we have a way to access this experience in a way that historically has never really been available before. I mean, it's one thing for people to go and spend their lives meditating, but that's only been a small portion of humanity. And now that we know that 5-MeO-DMT has this capacity, and that anyone who's interested and willing to go through this complete stripping away of their personal identity, if they want to do it, it's available, it's there. And so it makes it so much more accessible than it's ever been in human history, just because we're now aware of it and that this is a molecule that people can find access to if, you know, they're curious enough.
Yeah. It's clearly we're kind of at a crux point in history then, because I mean, it is available and there's interest, and it seems like I don't know, a lot of people, you know, will talk about this as being a pivotal point in history, you know, as some kind of turning point. You know, there's some kind of mass consciousness, mass movement, transformative movement going on. But when you talk about things like this, it really it really brings that message home that, yeah, there might be something really interesting going on in the collective consciousness.
Yeah, you know, for so much of human history, these medicines have been a part of human culture and society, but for the most part, they were only enjoyed or utilized by specific initiated elite groups, such as shamans or particularly, you know, different religious sects or things like that, where there's an initiation and it's all secret and that it's not widely known within society. And then so that was a huge part of human history for countless millennia. And then in the modern era, we went through this. Hopefully now we're starting to get over this bizarre war on drugs and this idea that we've got to stamp out all of this stuff and that it's all bad somehow. That we do seem to be at a turning point where not only are we perhaps getting over the war on drugs, but this is now public knowledge and it's being studied in universities, and there's scientific research being done, and there's treatment and healing centers now popping up around the world, and ayahuasca is spreading all around the world. So it's happening in a way that's public and accessible to people that it never before has been in human history. So, you know, whether or not there's something bigger going on, just certainly at that very practical level, there is more access and information to entheogens and psychedelics than there has ever been in human history before. And even in just now the last 10 years or so now, with the resurgence of scientific research and medical research, it's just blossoming. And I don't think it can be controlled at this point, that this is going to usher in a new wave of understanding and access, and more people than ever are experiencing these things. So in that sense, yeah, the change is happening. It's happening right now. We are a part of it. This podcast right here, right now, this is part of it. It is spreading this information and letting people know about what's going on. And the thought that we could actually reach maybe a tipping point of humanity where people can really realize their true nature and we can get over our shit and stop killing each other and fighting over whose holy book is the most holy, or who's got the right haircut or listens to the right kind of music, or whatever the fuck we're killing each other over.
Yeah.
That this is amazing. And it hasn't, the tipping point hasn't tipped yet, but I think perhaps we're on our way. So I'm very hopeful. I mean, I look at society and I see a lot of things that are just, oh man, that's really terrible.
Yeah.
But I'm overall, I'm actually very optimistic and very hopeful about the way that things are going. And part of what makes me hopeful is just this thought that in the end, reality always wins. It doesn't really matter what people believe or what they think or what false projections they're holding on to. In the end, reality always wins.
Sure.
And there might be a lot of damage in the process, but reality will always win. And the reality is that we are all this one unitary being. and we're all here together. So we might as well wake the fuck up to it and get over our shit and stop pretending to be whatever the hell it is that we think we are, and just be what we are. And if people could do that, it's going to be sweet.
I think that's the key point of the whole night right there. It's it's fantastic.
That was great.
I mean, it's unfortunately we're reaching the end of this hour already. I really, maybe at another point we could dig deeper into. I wanted to talk about the nature of consciousness and the ego. I want to talk about a little bit more about Buddhism and Taoism, but I mean, I guess for right now, Martin, why don't you tell everybody, well, tell them where they can find you, and tell them a little bit about your books.
All right, so we'll wrap it up with a quick promo.
Yeah.
My website is martinball.net, martinball.net, and as you mentioned, yes, I do art, music, and I write a lot of books, so that's pretty much all available there on that particular webpage. My webpage for my art is fractalimagination.com, and got lots of cool fractal art there. I host the Entheogenic Evolution podcast, which you can find on iTunes just as the Entheogenic Evolution. And I went through a time period where I was just giving lectures on the podcast, but in recent years I've been back into doing interviews. So I've got lots of interviews with all different kinds of people over there, and a lot of it is focusing on entheogens and the non-dual experience. My most recent book, as you mentioned, is Being Infinite, and it's sort of a memoir and autobiography. And really the inspiration for writing it was that I've had a lot of people ask me, like, well, how did you, kind of like we started out here, how did you get into entheogens? How did you learn what you've learned and experience what you've experienced? And so I figured, well, I just write it into a book, so eventually I can just tell people, here's the book. But that's like my 14th or 15th book. So I've written a lot of books, including 5 novels. I've written, as far as I know, the world's only novel about 5-MeO-DMT. It's called Beyond Azara. And it comes directly out of my own experiences with 5-MeO and ayahuasca, but it's all in a fictional context. And my goodness, I guess that's probably all I could say at the moment. And there are lots of other books too, so anyone who's interested can go check them out.
Great. And we're certainly, as always, link your website, all your contact in the description of the video. Martin, it's been really great. I wish we had more time. I really hope you come back on with us soon.
Well, it's been great. It's a lot of fun speaking with you guys, and this is the first time I've done an interview with 2 people on the other end, so that's been fun in and of itself, and I appreciate the questions that you asked. Really allowed me a lot of space to kind of get into some interesting stuff. So I've had an excellent time being on your podcast. Enjoyed it very much.
Well, we certainly enjoyed it too.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin.
All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Free Radical Media Podcast.